Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. Glad you could make it for another journey and adventure of tuning. Today I wanted to talk to you about that stuff that's all around us all the time. That is air. It is very compressible and it does have quite a big bearing and influence on what happens inside the engine, how it manipulates power, and some things that we need to take into account when we tune for it. So let's get started. So the first part is we'll talk about the springiness related to air in terms of pressure and specifically the intake runner length versus engine RPM. So for this, we have a simple diagram here. You can see we have this would be the intake manifold plenum here on the right. And then this would be our tube, our intake runner tube over here. And then this is our intake valve in here. And you can see the air is traveling this way. So this would be wide open throttle, right? And you can see we have a little legend up here that's showing us, the relative, essentially, air pressure differences. So the air pressure is the same in the plenum and the runner. The piston, or the cylinder, I should say, has less, which is why the air is moving. So everything's hunky-dory until this intake valve slams shut over here. Now all of a sudden we have the beginnings of a spring. This air is still under the same pressure, but it doesn't know what's going on way up in front of the line up here. So now this stuff starts getting backed up and starts getting compressed and compressed. This is an over exaggeration. I don't think the entire intake runner tube is fully compressed like this. But point being, whatever it is, we do have a pressure differential. This plenum at wide open throttle is typically going to be whatever the ambient air pressure is, and then you have this pressure in here, which is going to be greater. So what do you think will happen? If you guess the air is going to shoot back into the plenum, you are 100% right. So it pushes all back this way, and then because air is stupid and compressible, I mean, it's not stupid, but it overcorrects, right? So now we have this partial vacuum left behind. Well, what is going to happen when we have less pressure over here and a lot of pressure in the plenum? Well, if you guess the air pressure wants to equalize, you'd be right. And then we have the same situation where due to pressure, we're pushing air back in and then it goes back out again. As long as this is closed, we're going to have these oscillations of that pressure wave going back and forth. So ideally, whenever that pressure wave returns after it's bounced around a few times, the intake valve is going to be open and it can accept that pressure from the intake runner. And whenever that happens, you get a mild supercharging effect that increases the volumetric efficiency of the motor and will increase horsepower and torque accordingly. Pretty sweet. But the opposite can happen. If this is in tune, right, this is what we want, but, just as many times as this perfect situation will happen, this bad situation will happen, which is the intake valve opens while we have a negative pressure wave on this side. And so that will reduce the volumetric efficiency and torque and thus horsepower. So this is kind of a visualization of what happens when that intake valve slams shut. We have that red pressure wave that kind of bounces back and forth. And this does occur at the speed of sound. The speed of sound does change with ambient conditions. The number one factor is going to be the air temperature. The hotter the temperature, the faster that sound wave will move. I've also labeled the long side runner and the short side runner, but really it's going to be the total length, the average length of the short side, which includes the intake port on the cylinder head, the runner of the intake runner on the manifold, and then the same thing for the long side. So you would measure all of these distances, add them up, add the long sides and add the short sides, and then divide them by two, and that would give you just this middle, the average length of that runner. All right, so this does mean that there's going to be harmonics that you are going to see. So something like this. This would be your engine torque, and you're going to see these little sine waves, these little ripples start to develop. And every time you have a peak, That's an indication that a positive pressure wave happened to be perfectly timed with the opening of the intake valve. And then these dips are going to represent when you had the negative pressure wave return when that intake valve opens. So there's a really nice calculator out there, Bowling's Intake Runner Computator, and this is the link to it. Um, and the only downside, though, is that you cannot do decimals. It's in inches, it's not in metric or anything like that. So it's in inches, but you can only do whole inches. So in my case, I had some LS3 ported heads from GPI and the LS3 intake runner. Unfortunately, I don't have the stock LS3 heads. I wish I could measure those, but I'm assuming the ported ones, the short and long side of the heads are going to be a little bit longer since they were made bigger. It should be longer, I would think. Either that, or maybe it evens out in the wash and the long side becomes longer, but the side is shorter, but they still even out. I really don't know. Either way, with the stock LS3 intake, I came up with a total of 16 and a half inches. And so this where this comes into play. You can do 16 or 17. I just so I did both of these and then I averaged them out. And this is what I came up with for my car. Now, the other interesting thing is we see that there are harmonics in here, and we'll get to that in a minute. We'll see how this plays out. So I took a dyno graph. This is when my car was full bolt-ons, so mechanically stock, but headers, cold air intake, ported throttle body, nothing major, right? Internally stock LS3. And I put these little red boxes around where the predicted harmonics were and then versus where I saw them. So you can see this little swell in here. Now on the stock cam, it's not very visible, but they are there. Um, so I basically, this is the same graph, but all I did was I just stretched it and skewed it to kind of make it a little bit more apparent where these little swells and valleys are. And then I added these arrows just to kind of, so you can see where it is. But either way, you can still see that we have these little harmonics in here. So fast forward a few years, lifter fails and I rebuild the engine and I put on the SS3 cam from GPI, and then they ported the heads to factory heads. And now this is what the dyno graph looks like. And you can definitely see there are some big swells in here. And it's my assumption or theory that the reason why they are there so much more prominent is because the camshaft is holding the intake valve open longer. So there should be a little bit more generous of a sweet spot in terms of that mild supercharging effect. That's my theory anyway. Either way, but this is what we have. Now, this was also with the ported heads. So I would think that it would be a little bit longer total intake runner length. So when I put these graphs on top of each other or overlay them, I was expecting to see the harmonic shift go lower RPMs because they're dealing with longer intake runner length, but instead it actually shifted forward. And I did some lines here just to kind of line up the peaks and valleys so you can see. Um, so one possible or several possible sources of error is just the intake manifold, the heat inside of that thing. I mean, yes, did dynos correct for weather? Yeah, but that's just for power. What dynos don't do is say, well, if it's this hot, what's the speed of sound and what's the length of the intake runners, and let's like try to normalize where those harmonics will occur. It definitely does not do that. It could be the factory converter versus aftermarket converter slipping a little bit. Who knows? But either way, the ripples are still there, and you can kind of see for the most part, they do line up. And of course, they were on different dynos too. So, kind of just going over a little bit of why possibly the aftermarket cam had more stronger peaks and valleys. Really, we're dealing with 267 degrees of intake duration on the LS3 cam, and mind you, that's at 4 thousandths lift. The SS3 cam is 285, and that's at 6 thousandths lift. So if we were to, stretch that out down to 4 thousandths, it may be up to 290 total duration. I don't really know. But either way, just, comparing the cams while we're talking about this stuff. All right, so let's get into some of the good stuff here. So this is the Holley High Ram, 6.5 inch runners on the intake, and if we assume 5.5 inches on the cylinder heads, that gives us a total length of 12 inches. And one of the descriptions I found for this is it's, between 7 and 8,000 RPMs. And when we plug that into Bowling's intake runner calculator, sure enough, 73 to 84. Now, this third harmonic is important, and that's typically where most engine builders are going to shoot for the intake runner. Um, and I think that's a balance of both the length of the intake runner, but also and when I say length, I mean um, long intake runners, as you'll see, are going to be responsible for slowing down the velocity and maybe creating turbulence where you don't want it. So it's kind of a balance of RPM and length altogether. So how does this do on the dyno? Well, you can see these ripples here, and a little maybe this third one forming over here, right? So we can see these now. The Bowling's calculator, it doesn't show us the fifth harmonic, right? Just the fourth. So, um, but again, this intake isn't really made to go down this low. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about harmonics. So maybe you're going to say, well, wait, I notice the lower the harmonic, the higher return on investment that we get, right? So where's the first one? Well, there is no first harmonic. That would be the fundamental frequency or the root note. So basically, this is just talking about how many times it's bouncing back and forth between the plenum and the intake valve. And as we lose energy, every bounce we lose some, right? So the thing is the speed of sound is pretty fast compared to how fast that intake valve is opening. So if you do want to hit that fundamental frequency or the root note, as you will see, it's going to take a lot of RPMs to do that. So if we just take a look at this, right, and this is with 12 inches, right? So that high ram example. If we look at this, right, we're looking at 13 to 17, maybe 18,000 RPMs. Probably in the range of a Formula One engine, but not the range of your average domestic V8 or LS motor. So not so great, right? So if we do want to hit that, we're going to have to wind this thing beyond its useful rate of return or useful RPMs. So what if we want to hit the fundamental frequency in a different way? Well, we could make the total intake runner length longer, right? So if we put in a ridiculous number like 36, you can see, boom, 3,200 to 4,000 RPMs. That's definitely within range. And, potentially we could even hit that fundamental frequency. Well, that sounds good on paper, but in the reality is that's not how physics works. So we'll get to that in a second. So Chrysler, those crazy guys back in the 60s and 70s, they created the long ram intake, which had 31-inch runners, and I think they had a short ram which was like maybe 25 or 26-inch runners. I'm not really sure. These intake manifolds developed some pretty tremendous torque, and you think about the size of the Chrysler cars back then, the land yachts, they needed a lot of torque, and I'll tell you, this thing makes some ridiculous torque. And if we follow the trend up here, we look at, hey, maybe 66 to 8,400 RPMs. That is definitely achievable. There's people running LSs up to 8,500 RPMs. Granted, they're more like a dedicated race engine rather than a street engine, but it can be done. So I found this guy who actually had a dyno test, a modern day dyno on this old intake. Now, this was on a big block 440 Chrysler. I don't know, we know that it's 31-inch runners, right? We don't really know how long the intake ports are on the head for Chryslers. I guessed 5, which puts us, 36-inch total. We look at this. Now, I'll be honest with you, this guy had major problems getting the dyno to read anything low RPMs. I mean, he hit the gas on this motor and it just blasted through the dyno, couldn't get a reading. So you can see the lowest number he got was 3,000 RPMs and 569 foot-pounds of torque, which is pretty amazing. And you can see this line coming down. It dips below 500, and then what does it do? It comes back up. And then the trends that you're going to see with these long intake runners is power drops off dramatically after you hit that peak. And that has to do with you just can't move a high volume of air through really long intake runner tubes. It chokes it down quite a bit. So it's not done. To answer the question, why don't we see this? Is because really you're peaked. You're kind of handicapped. You get up to mid RPMs, and that's really about all you can do. And then also the underhood packaging issues. Chrysler, I would say, was they had this cross ram or whatever you want to call it. And now think from the OEM's perspective of, well, now we have two carburetors. So, is a production modern day production car going to have some sort of cross ram with two throttle bodies on it? I highly doubt it. So under the hoods are packed enough right now. I don't know how they would fit any more ridiculously, long intake runners under modern day vehicles. So Holley, not to be outdone though, created the Sky Ram. I think this was originally a April Fool's Day joke, but anyway, just the runners themselves on the intakes were 36 inches. If we assume 5.5 inches for the cylinder head ports, we get a total of 41.5. So again, it rounds up to 42 on bowlings, but you can see peak torque or the second harmonic is coming in at 28 to 3,400 RPM. So we do have this on dyno. This is a well-documented intake. You can look at it and look at this ridiculous peak right here, right? It spikes up pretty awesome and then it swells back up again and then power just drops off. The red lines are the high ram. You can ignore that. We're looking at the black lines here. So tremendous power. I mean, that's like two-stroke 125cc dirt bike power band like a light switch, right? That thing is ridiculous. So pretty awesome. Not to be outdone was this another YouTuber guy, Thunderhead 289. I don't know. I don't remember how long those intake runners are, but assuming he's almost 6 feet tall or so, those probably got to be 5 foot runners. And I have not seen a dyno chart on that, so I don't know. But I would imagine probably even less streetable and drivable than the Skyram. So the conclusion for the intake runners is the argument for making short ones is essentially logically, virtually, they stack on each other. Those pulses, they resonate, they have certain frequencies that they hit, and you have those options, kind of like building with Legos. Like in this, are we dealing with this harmonic or are we dealing with this harmonic? We can deal with multiples when we have a shorter one. So those harmonics can stack. Whereas if we just have one long one, we kind of lose that those harmonics spread out over a longer RPM range. So just some other general things before we move on and you only look at intake runners based on their length is the cross-sectional area, the taper of the runner, what's the plenum? Do you have air horns extending into the plenum or is it open where like on that high ram that we looked at before, the runners just kind of terminate with a nice radius inside of a box. And then also the plenum size and volume. Now, not to be outdone, I decided to do some math myself in a spreadsheet. When we look at this, the thing is, I'm not sure how bowling, I just pasted this here to be apples for apples. You can see this one says 16 inches right here, and I put 16 inches in my equation over here. Now, I was trying to experiment and try to figure out like how are they coming up with these harmonics? They seem fairly accurate from the random dyno charts that I'm pulling off the internet as well as, my own personal experience. So all I did was we take the intake runner length of this many inches. If we know the speed of sound in feet per second, then we also know it in inches per second. And if we know how long the intake runner is in inches, then we know how long it's going to take for time wise Maybe we can zoom in a little bit here to make this easier to read. So SOS, speed of sound, inches per second. That's what this feet per second is. The pressure wave would take, just over a thousandth of a second to reach the plenum. And then if we double that, that's from the plenum back to the intake valve. So that's one round trip. Speed of sound, by the way, I used 1150 feet per second, which just on this lookup chart is about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So based off of that, we get down to this chart, right? And so this is round trip one. So this is down and back, which I would think would be the optimal frequency to hit. That's going to require 51,000 RPMs. Again, out of the question. So I just each round trip, right? So I just kind of started looking at these things. And if we pull this guy over here, um, I did the color coding, like 73 to 89, right? So I did my best to get that. And then the second harmonic, like I don't really see a relevance in the data of why after six round trips is that the second harmonic. So I'm not really sure. I could not draw any conclusions from that. But the other interesting thing or dismaying thing at first, when I first worked this up, I'm like, what a waste of time. Because if you look at this, we're getting round trips all the time. Like between 3,000 and 3,900 RPMs, we have what, six round trips where we're bouncing? But when we look in here, this data is much more spread apart. Well, why is that? And then I just did this one. I just used a slightly different calculations, and it kind of, it did. It corresponded or corroborated my results over here, just as kind of a sanity check. Now, I tell you all of this because I almost didn't include this in this presentation. I thought it was a waste of time, but then I realized I have my very first dyno sheet that I ever did, and this data looks awfully suspicious, like maybe there is a correlation. Let's take a look. All right, so you can see all of these bounce backs. So all I did was I just drew this vertical red line in here. I know it's not the fanciest looking thing. Now this is a stock, my car, well, not completely stock. I was a baller, right? I had a cold air intake and a ported throttle body. And I came in on the dyno 357 and I walked out 375. I was king of the roads, let me tell you. But I never understood, like, why is there so many ripples in this? Every other dyno chart I've ever seen has been relatively smooth, but this thing looks ridiculous. But there is a correlation. So I just, if we go back, like, if you look at these RPMs, all I did, I put a little dot down here and then just I drew lines up and pretty much they correspond. Look at that peak. Look at that peak. This one's close. This one's in the middle, right? But all of the other ones, that's a little peak, that's a little peak, that's a peak, that's a little peak. Like it all works out. So I guess I didn't waste my time too much on that spreadsheet, but I would really like to know how that Bowling's calculator is finding those other harmonics and resonances. Okay, part four. Air is a spring as it relates to air velocity, and this is playing off the camshaft's intake valve closing angle. So, in general, I say the intake valve closing angle is the most important of all the cam specs. And in short, the longer the valve stays open, the more air you can stuff into the cylinder. The only way to do that, though, is to go to higher RPMs, and that is because when you go to higher RPMs, you're increasing your cubic feet, CFM of air, I should say, and that air has velocity. It has kinetic energy. It's moving fast, and as Newton says, anything in motion tends to stay in motion, including air. The downside to that late intake valve closing angle is there is a lot of reversion at low RPMs, which means you lose volumetric efficiency at low RPMs. So just in general, we have a pretty simple graph. Our piston is going down and the air is coming in, represented by this green column of air. Once we hit bottom dead center and the piston starts to turn around, well, now this original column of air starts getting compressed, but we have a new batch of air coming in, right? Just because the piston has stopped does not mean the air that's going into the cylinder wants to stop. It wants to keep going. And then finally, piston is still going up on the compression stroke, but that intake valve is still open. The original column of air that came in on the intake stroke is really compressed. This orange column here is represented by what came in at bottom dead center. And then the very last little top layer is that last little bit of supercharging effect. So as long as the pressure in the intake, in the induction track is greater than the pressure created by the piston going up, the cylinder will continue to fill with air. So there are some limitations for the intake valve closing or just that mild supercharging effect. So I think, you know, airspeed, right? It turns out about Mach 0.55 is ideal. And once you go over that, that's when you're going to start seeing when you look at the dyno chart, the horsepower is just going to level off. That means the air velocity is too high. And that air velocity is a balance of inertia, speed, and density. Um, there's a great other YouTuber out there, Bane Racing, and he talks a lot about this. I wish his videos were longer, but they're usually like a minute to 3 minutes. And, he just kind of wets your whistle a little bit, and you're like, I want to know more. Tell me more. But I would highly recommend checking out his channel. He's got a lot of good information on there. But it's all about speed. And you look at military jets that go supersonic. Well, the intake for those engines actually has to slow the air down before it gets into the turbines so the turbines can compress it. So there is, reasons to slow down airflow. And not that we necessarily want to slow down, but ideally we want to target this just over half a Mach. All right. Now, as far as how does all this stuff relate to tuning, let's get into that. So if we look at this, this blue line is kind of a stock torque curve, right? And then our orange line is, hey, we've done something to improve volumetric efficiency, better cam, heads, intake, whatever. It will increase it, right? Our ability to fill the cylinder with more air increases, so power increases. And then we have this characterization or influence of whatever this intake runner length is doing. So ideally, you would be tuning for that third harmonic, right? Where this is going to kind of carry you, right? We've hit our high RPMs, we're driving forward, we're getting that last little shift point way up there. This is what you want to build for, right? That's the proper combination. You don't want to have your engine fall on its face before you get to that third harmonic. So to me, it looks like bacon strips on the dyno chart, right? All those little ripples, those characterizations. So the harmonics, as you saw on the other dyno sheets, they are going to show on the harmonics will show on the dyno chart, which means they're also going to show on your VE table, or they should, I would say. So in this example, we can see a VE table, and you can start to see these ripples forming in here, right? This is the impact of those intake runner links on here. A lot of people will say, "Oh, your VE should be totally smooth," and I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. In this case, I don't see these other ripples necessarily up here so much, but these at these RPM show precisely right on there. So what this means is when you go to interpolate with the grain. So go with the map sensor. It is much more linear as you go higher pressures at the same RPM. If you were to interpolate this way, you would smooth over these ripples and these peaks and you would lose that characterization. So rezone your VE as needed to make sure that you accommodate those ripples. So there's a lot to that. This is an art. I'm not going to say I'm a master at rezoning or anything like that, but you should not be afraid to rezone your virtual VE table. If you go in the virtual or the VVE assistant that I created, you go to help and you go to how to manipulate VVE. It will take you to a post on HP tuners that I made, and it's going to kind of show you here's the shapes that the coefficient allows and what they don't allow. What you can do is S shapes. You cannot, the coefficients will not accommodate that. So you get curves and you get flats, but you cannot do S shapes. So don't ignore the influence of the harmonics. Take those into account. I mean, this is actual airflow going into your cylinder. It needs to be modeled. Now, I'm not saying that you should ignore, potential problems, right? So, this is another car that I'm working on. It's an LS3 with a BTR Stage 2 cam, and you can see the influence of these harmonics here. We have a little peak, a little ridge in here, and a little ridge in here, and then we have a valley down here. So this isn't the final VE shape. I mean, this is just kind of, I pasted it in just to kind of show you I haven't smoothed it. I'm not even done tuning this thing. But that is these ripples, right? They are real. You need to account for them. Random spikes and valleys, like, no, that's bad data, right? So you need to start thinking about what's bad data versus what's a trend that I need to take into account. So most people are going to tell you smooth. Your VE table should be smooth. And I say no. Like to me, I see that overly perfect VE table, and it's like, man, you're some crazy Hollywood actress that has 10 pounds of makeup on and so much Botox. Your face is bloated and like it's ugly. Like this is not a real human, right? And it's the same thing for a VE table. You need to account for these little micro trends in here, right? That's part of it. That is air going into the engine. Now, it should be smooth. You should have smooth transitions. I'm not saying ignore rough areas, but I'm saying find those little trends and smooth them out. That's what you need to do. So don't go for smooth sake, right? So it may be a balance of I need it smooth, but I need some realism, and there may be some, uh, less than desirable areas. But again, that's practice, right? To get better. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you got something out of this. I'll see you in the winner circle.